So this video is going to be about my grandmother, who I love dearly and who I've always had a very close relationship with. My sisters and my other family members have sometimes moved away from my grandmother, but since I became reunited with her in my early 20s, I've made a commitment to staying with her and my grandfather as far as spending many, many, many years. For a long, long time, helping them pretty much weekly with their home, with cleaning or with gardening or different tasks. Like my grandfather told me on his deathbed that I was one of his favorites, and I pretty much like already knew that. Like I already knew that my grandfather and I had a sweet connection, and he would often have me do tasks as an adult because he would get like crazy ideas in his mind of things that he wanted accomplished, and he would have me do those things like dig around in trash cans for things that he thought had drifted in there, and sometimes like find things for him in trash cans. But he was a businessman, and he was a real sweetheart in a lot of ways. He had his faults like anyone. And my grandmother, my mom told me at one point that my grandparents, she thought that they should have divorced. That what my mom told me was that there wasn't always like joy and happiness there, that they had complexity in their relationship, like any relationship. But I think my mother was trying to let me know that in some ways my grandmother didn't live the life that she could have had made available to her. That the way my grandmother described it to me is she had 4 kids and she basically had 5 children, because my grandfather came to the marriage with a child from a previous relationship. But that my grandmother really had to be devoted to the care of these children, and then my grandfather, came from a very sexist generation, and so my grandmother finally was able to go back to school. But when she went back to school, she got her AA degree, and she really told me she wanted to go to the university to get a bachelor's degree, but she felt that she couldn't do that, that there really wasn't the opportunity for that, and her job was supporting my grandfather with his business. So in general, within the family, there was a lot of subjugating oneself to the idea of the masculine, of what the male needs were. So the family had this kind of overarching theme of the women, and I picked up on this from a fairly young age, but the women had lesser roles in the family. Like the women that stood out, that were opinionated, were talked about in disparaging terms, but the women that were upheld as being good women were women that were, towing the party line, that didn't question their husbands, that didn't embarrass their husbands publicly. So it was like the good woman that was applauded within the family culture, and the bad woman was, my aunt or my cousin, or, other women that were somehow different. They were different, they were strange, they were odd, they had opinions and so forth. But what was upheld were these men that were considered to be like the self-actualized, like winners of the family, and they received preferential treatment. And even my mother discussed that there was a real emphasis on the boys in the family, and kind of buoying up those boys, like really supporting those boys and that male energy. And the female voice was really lost within the family. So my grandmother survived within the family by really pacifying her voice in a lot of ways. Um, and so she's not someone that ever like embraced conflict or addressed conflict. She was more of a stuffer. She would stuff her emotions. And there were a couple times like I did therapy with my grandmother when I was in graduate school, and she really seemed to enjoy it. Like she really seemed to benefit from it. Like she did have a very insightful curiosity to her in terms of her desire to learn more about her own psyche and kind of go into those Jungian depths. And it was interesting to see this little bit of part of her that probably had gotten swept under the rug, that finally was allowed to come out in our discussions when we did like little mini therapy sessions. Um, So my grandfather passed away, and my grandmother currently is, at the end of times. And when we think about being born and being dying spiritually are some of the toughest times in our lives. Like, it's really hard work. We leave one world and we enter this one, and then we depart from this world and potentially enter another one, depending upon your belief system. And the body knows that it's going to die, right? Some people believe that you should be able to have assisted suicide. And I read an interesting story recently with an older couple that were scientists, and they had done a will, but they both committed like a joint suicide with their family's knowledge when they were like 90 or 89 or something. And the reason that they did that was that they really didn't want to be a burden on their children, and they really didn't want to just get to the point where they had dementia or they weren't mentally able to be here on this plane. So they really wanted to kind of go out with all their faculties, and that was their choice. And that's just interesting. If you don't look at it from a religious perspective, if you just look at it from this is their life and it's their right to choose when it ends, it's interesting because I see my grandmother sometimes struggle with that, where she'll talk about death in kind of obscure ways, but she won't necessarily bring it up. Recently, she brought it up with me, but like normally she doesn't bring it up. And she'll make these flippant remarks sometimes, but it's almost like in this culture, Western culture, where we don't talk about death and we have this incessant fear of death, we don't really have a living relationship with death. There's a lot of cultural experts that speak to that in Mexican culture, perhaps you have more of a sense of not being an enemy with death, that death is part of life and life is part of death, and we can openly acknowledge that death exists. But I feel like with Western culture, like if you bring up death, people are like, you're talking about the boogeyman and like you're not supposed to talk about death. But I think that is unfortunate because that time when people are at the end of their lives is really one of the times to do some of the ripest and most meaningful work spiritually with them, in terms of coming to terms with their end of life issues, maybe making amends, saying sorry or showing regret or acknowledgement of the pain that we've caused others. Like it can be a deep time of healing and introspection. There was a study done recently at Johns Hopkins University, which is an accredited and respected university, that gave hallucinogenic mushrooms to cancer patients that had a fear of death. And universally, all of the participants reflected that experience really relieved a lot of their fears around death. And if you think about shamanism and the role of mushrooms or other medicines traditionally in different indigenous cultures, you would see that there's more of a marrying of how do we hone and refine and respect this critical special time when someone is at their end of days, and looking into the mystery of death, and how do we gently support them for that. I was present when my mother passed away at her bedside, and it was very deeply meaningful. It was like one of the most meaningful experiences of my life, and I can't imagine not having been there. So I think being there for people's death, being present with them, is so critical. And sometimes, like, that person who is failing, is looking into the eyes of whoever's there, and they're asking permission to not only ask those deep questions, but they're also asking permission to be scared or be questioning or feel nervous or whatever. Um, and so I think sometimes what we do in Western cultures, we have this very dumbed down experience with folks who are dying or who are near death, in terms of talking about their own death or that they're likely to die soon, or having deeper discussions. And so I've experienced this with my own family, where I'll see my grandmother is actually ready or poised or open to having discussions that are deeper than what she's handed. And I feel like what she's handed are kind of like dumb, stupid conversations that are very one dimensional. What did you eat today? And how are you feeling today? And did you read about the newspaper? Did you see about the weather? And that wouldn't make me want to live. You know what I mean? If everyone reduced conversations down to this very limited pool of questions and discourse and engagement. It makes for a very kind of one-dimensional experience, and it kind of, I'm sure the soul of the person feels somewhat like dumbed down by that experience. So that can be really heartbreaking, I think, on some level, even if the person's not conscious of it, even if they are not like psychologically conscious of how this dim, dumbed down conversation is impacting them. But one thing that stood out to me with my grandmother is that there's been a couple of times where she opens up the conversation. It's broader, and I feel like there's this fierceness that comes up in the family culture, like this fierceness of protection around my grandmother that's unnecessary or unneeded. And I think sometimes what happens is that when a family is shifting and that paradigm is shifting, and this is the matriarch of the family, when she goes, the whole family will shift. You know, that whole framework will shift. So sometimes, like those matriarchs, those elders, are really holding the family together. And so when that shifts, then it can create fear and panic in people, even if they're not aware of it, because it makes them, you know, closer to the end of their lives. Like they're the next ones that are going to die. And it causes them to look at their own mortality and look at those they've wronged, or, you know, their own actions that have caused hurt with others. And it also, it's the loss of what that person means to you. So if that person means stability or what have you. So I think a lot of times there's this, you know, projection by the family onto that elder that's like, no, 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 I need you not to be scared of death. I need you to just live in this kind of numbed out, suppressed fog before you die, instead of having some deep existential questioning or having an epiphany or doing any kind of soul work or anything like that, because I need this to be kind of like a sewn up deal where our ending with you is going to end on the same, like in a controllable way. I need you to be controlled. And so you see a lot of elders that are over medicated, and a lot of elders that are suffering from pain due to the aches and the, you know, pain that goes along with growing older. Um, and and as I look at my grandmother's health, having been someone that studied with a bushman in the Belize jungle and studied alternative health for most of my life, and worked as a nursing assistant for many years for a children's hospital and for at-home care for elders and for children with medical needs. And then I'm a licensed mental health therapist, and I ran an organic farm greenhouse. So like I've had this constant litany of like acupuncturists and naturopaths and herbalists and um, massage therapists and healers of all kinds, whether they're documented in that white Western male framework or not. So I've had a lot of exposure to health and healing. And as I've come to the table within my own family to say, hey, I have some insight into my grandmother's healing, you know, you might want to consider that. The feedback that I've received is that my input is not appreciated, it's not validated. And it would appear that what would validate my input would be as if I had a medical degree of some kind. So I'm a licensed therapist, and oftentimes therapists work in hospital settings and have exposure to medications and doctors and concepts of health and healing, but somehow that's like a soft science. So that spiritual work combined with the physical or medical aspects of growing older, I'm somehow within that family context not allowed to comment or make suggestions, which then for me is like a trigger, because when my mom was dying, the first time around, she was put on hospice, and I'd been fighting with my family for a while to try to implement this supplement that I truly believe in called SAMe. It's very helpful, and it's been used for a long time in Italy and so forth for depression, but it also helps with the liver, and it also helps with depression, the liver, general cell health, and one other area, joints. So cell longevity, which affects lifespan, liver detoxification, which affects anyone who's got a compromised liver, depression, anyone who's suffering from any kind of depression, and then joint health. So the whole time that I kept adding my 2 cents to the mix, it wasn't a validating experience. It was like, here I come to the table with my input, which is, could we try my mom on this supplement? And the response that I continually got during that time of my mother being quite ill was, We don't want your input. Your input is not necessary. You don't know what you're talking about, right? And I would argue with folks because I tend to believe in myself, and I don't always believe that people know what they're talking about when they tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. But like my response to that was, well, I still am going to advocate for this for my mother. So my mom got quite ill, and then she was on home hospice, and that's like when you're given about 3 months and to live, and the expectation is that you're going to die. And I remember talking to the nurse, the hospice nurse, and I said, could I start my mom on SAMe? Could my mom start taking SAMe now? And the hospice nurse was a very kind, gentle old soul. And she was like, sweetie, your mom's dying. Like at this point, you can do anything you want. Like it doesn't matter. So during that time, my mom tried the SAMe, and she ended up coming off of hospice, and she lived for about 2.5 more years. And it was the only change that was made in her medication and her supplements at that time, in terms of what could you pin her dramatic reversal of her, the writing on the wall that she was going to die and then given 2.5 more years of life. Like, what could you pin that on? So it was really a struggle for me at that time not to hold on to anger in my heart, because for me, I literally saw that it was the supplement. Like, that was the only thing that changed in her whole medical treatment, was this one supplement, because they pretty much were preparing for her body to die. So that was like the only change that was recorded. But my family never came to me and said, we think you were right. We think you were right about that supplement. And we want to apologize because we were assholes and we didn't listen to you and we dismissed your opinion. And we told you because you don't have a medical degree, you know nothing, and that your input is not appreciated or welcome, right? No one came to me to apologize and say, maybe if we had started this before, your mom would have lived longer, right? So I live with that guilt of like, oh, if I had just fought these people sooner, and really like, because my mom's health was so imperative, if I had really fought these people sooner, my mom would have lived longer. You know what I mean? Like, those are just the things that I have to think about, in my life, is what could I have done to keep my mother alive, and why didn't these people listen to me, and what does that speak to? And a lot of times it speaks to who has power and control in a family. So my mom's family came from a very patriarchal background where the women played very supportive roles to the men. And then the women that were like the strong women that actually were different and had a voice and were opinionated were often typified as difficult or ornery or oddballs, or, they weren't given the same respect as the women in the family that were kind of like the sidekicks to the men. So it's an interesting family to be in as a woman, just because the messages are so clear regarding what roles will be applauded and what roles will not be applauded. As far as my grandmother goes, my grandmother ended up getting cancer, and having listened to Gabor Mate's most recent speech, which blew my mind, I fell asleep listening to that last night, but he was talking about sickness and what he saw as a medical doctor and what leads to sickness. And what he said was basically that repressing our emotions leads to sickness. So stuffing our emotions. So everything we're taught as children, like, I'm going to suppress my emotions so that I don't bother people and I don't upset people, and I will keep my emotions stifled, like, so that I'm not a problem to anyone. These are all things that become toxic inside of us. So those things that we think we're doing, that we are applauded for in this culture, and what Gabor Mate brought up was he learns a lot from obituaries. And what he did was he brought out examples of obituaries. And they were examples of people that were like, they put their family first and they never said no to anybody, and they died on the job they were working so hard. So basically, you're praising workaholism, right? That causes what? Divorce and alcoholism and people being estranged from their own selves. Like, so you're applauding workaholism. You're also applauding people that didn't have good boundaries, that pretty much like just did whatever anyone needed, and constantly were meeting others' needs and not their own. And then people that never talked about anger or conflict and things like this. And so for my grandmother, I always noticed that, she was a cancer survivor, but like that she also did have that passive role in the family, that was the role that was kind of allotted to her, to be a woman that supported men, right? Not necessarily a woman in her own right, but a woman that very much was caught in that 1950s role structure of women are there as the sidekick to support the man. And that's why I thought it was always interesting that my mom had told me that she thought her parents should have gotten divorced. And my grandmother never mentioned that to me, but I really felt like my mom was saying that she didn't feel growing up that her parents were really happy, that they probably had a lot of unhappiness, but that the culture of the time was that you stuck it out, right? And you get into a habit of sticking it out. Maybe you like pile on the pounds and get really fat or whatever, but you stick it out because that's what people do, even to your own detriment. Even if your soul dies in that unhappy marriage, or you get really fat, or you get really unhealthy and you just stuff all your anger and your frustrations, or you grow apart from someone, you just, fucking stick it out. So it was interesting when Gabor Mate is talking about what leads to sickness. And what he said was that repression of emotion, repression of anger, trying to be all these things for other people, these are the things that bring about a sickness in the body, right? And my grandmother would avoid conflict like the plague. Like, she would never have conflict with people. And what Gabor Mate spoke to was, yes, we can have healthy conflict. Yes, we can express anger. Expressing anger is not an unhealthy thing. Letting someone know, like, get out of my space, is not an unhealthy thing. It's about protecting yourself. It's about knowing yourself and honoring yourself, loving yourself, all things that you need to know to be a self-actualized person in this world. But you're erecting boundaries, you're speaking up for yourself, you're standing up for yourself. These are all healthy things. So I struggled in the family because what I found was, as my grandmother has battled more and more with her pain and her suffering, with her physical body, I've really struggled with the fact that marijuana is legal in Washington state. And my grandmother could visit with my friend who's a naturopathic doctor, who's been a nurse for 30 years and is a gentle, gentle woman who could really find a cannabis. If you go to the local stores here, there's like 300 different varieties of cannabis. But the naturopathic doctor who specializes in cannabis, who's also a registered nurse, Dr. Pamela Smith in Seattle, she would have the knowledge to go through and find the right combination for my grandmother for her pain. But when I brought this up with my family in terms of, grandma's getting put on this Oxycontin is addictive and it's really toxic to the liver, and it just kind of numbs her out even more. Like, it makes our time with her during this precious time even more limited in that respect, because you're dealing with someone who's on pain pills, and cannabis, as long as it's like CBD or low THC, wouldn't necessarily cause that same reaction, and it would give her pain relief. So she could probably do more with her body and be in a more healthy place with her body. And what I received back, even though I live in one of the most liberal areas of the nation in terms of people being pro cannabis and totally aware of like cannabis and its medical health benefits. And there's all this research out of Israel that I sent my family, like 50 articles regarding dementia, regarding being a cancer survivor, regarding rheumatoid arthritis, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, all these things that I thought would legitimize this preference that they consider cannabis instead of going down the route of the Oxycontin and painkillers that are more difficult and more damaging on the body. And the response that I got back was very much like, this is not your place. You need to like zip it. It's very similar to when my mom was dying and I was trying to push the SAMe. So what do you do if you're in a culture, in a family that doesn't respect the female voice, that teaches that the female voice that is challenging the authority, the hierarchy of the family? As someone who loves my grandmother very much, who thinks about her all the time, who's very connected to her and have devoted my life to her, like, what does it mean to get that message, which is shut up, go back to the back of the bus, like no one wants your input? And it's been extremely hurtful. Like, I've been living in this state of sadness about this situation now for like 6 months. And my mind is constantly returning to this issue of like, don't they read the articles on medical cannabis? Don't they think that my grandmother is potentially guided by her family, and she's guided by her family's judgment of that medicine and her family's messages about what medicine to be open to? Like, she's tried acupuncture because she was guided in that direction. And I've made that point and it's fallen on deaf ears, which is, don't you think that she's guided by your relationship or aspects of your relationship? Like, look deeper at the psychology of whether certain people in the family could be power tripping without realizing it. Like, they're power tripping off being in control of someone else's body. They're power tripping over things that they may not realize they're misusing power over. They may be so unconscious in their own selves that they don't even realize that they're misusing power, and they're not even willing to ask those deeper questions of themselves, like, hey, am I misusing power? Or here's the second deep profound question: is my relationship with this family member at all influenced by, let's say, 60 years of history? Of course it is. Who would suggest otherwise, right? So if you have a relationship that goes back 60 years with the same person, you're going to have some failed conversations. You're going to have some moments of despondency or depression because you so earnestly wanted them to get some aspect of yourself, the child that always wants to be understood or have their needs recognized by the parent. And maybe those needs didn't get met. Maybe my grandmother, because in a lot of ways my grandmother's needs were not met by her mother. I think her mother was very emotionally withholding. My mother was emotionally withholding, and I believe her mother was emotionally withholding. But I see that pattern with these women of what they were given, and they were kind of given shitty mothering, right? So it's interesting to see how these relationships, the psychology of it, boils down. And so sometimes with my grandmother, I feel like she feels so badly about the way that she didn't parent in ways that she now wish she could have or would have had she had the ability. So that in some respects, I think she just wants to make it easy for everyone. So she doesn't push the envelope. She just does what she's told. And she's not living in a place of questioning alternative health. Like, she's not the one who's going to research acupuncture or research biofeedback or research herbs or homeopathy or things of this nature. Excuse me. So then it's on us, right? It's on us to be enlightened individuals to say homeopathy is a worthwhile medicine to consider, and it's going to be less intense than these heavy meds that tend to get thrown at the older folks, as if this time doesn't matter, as if this valuable time of them getting ready to say goodbye in life and doing that hard soul journey of leaving this place, this plane, isn't a special time, isn't a precious time. And so for my grandmother, I struggle with this because I don't feel like she's being given like the utmost in the health opportunities for healing that I would wish for her, in the same way that my mother wasn't. So it's a trigger for me because I wasn't listened to in regards to my mother. And then when I was finally listened to, it was like it almost didn't matter because she was dying. And yes, it gave her 2.5 more years, but it's not like my family ever recognized what it is that I brought to the table or that it provided my mother with 2.5 more years of life. It's like they are only willing to justify, it would appear, those who have a medical degree. So I feel like going to get a medical degree just so I can come back and be like, okay, here's my medical degree. Now will you listen to me? Like, now will you listen to me? Because I love my grandmother so much and I see her in pain, and I give her massages like I gave my grandfather massages. And I do believe in the healing power of touch, but that's nothing compared to what about finding a plant medicine like cannabis that isn't going to have the toxicity or the addictive aspects of these hardcore pain relievers like Oxycontin as she's suffering with pain. Like, we could find a way to creatively help her with her pain. Now, I do have a cousin that initially he and I bonded because he had talked about my grandfather and how when my grandfather was dying, he wasn't talking about his own death. His death was sitting there in the room waiting to take him. The Grim Reaper was just sitting there. And what my cousin reflected on was that my grandfather was like scared of death, or there's that culture of not talking about death. So then my grandfather was not talking about death. And it bothered my cousin because he said here was this right time for this old man to be really doing some deep work around what it means to die and what his death feels like and what what a special time it can be to say goodbye or to make amends or to have some deep conversations or what have you. And it was a struggle for my cousin because he felt like there was almost like an embarrassment, like, no, I'm not dying, no, I'm not dying, or death's a bad word. It's like the ultimate taboo. We can't talk about it. And it bothered his soul because he felt like, if I am paraphrasing correctly, it just felt like my grandfather was dying with unfinished business. Like he wasn't really doing the work of his soul work, right? Um, so it's interesting if my grandmother could be helped by that medicine of the cannabis, and yet the family is not willing to consider it. But if you ask them, like I asked one of my cousins, like, why can't you stand up for this? Like, you live in a state that's so progressive around cannabis medicine. Like, why couldn't my grandmother just visit with the naturopath and like, I'll pay for it? Like, why can't that happen? And the response that I got from my cousin was, well, if her doctor recommended it. And I was like, you mean her MD? And her doctor is someone like federally, you can't recommend it because of how the feds have structured that. So it's legal, but the feds, oversee um, the medical profession in the United States, so doctors can't necessarily recommend it. I mean, I've had doctors tell me like on the down low, like, hey, your disease would benefit from this, but I can't like actually recommend it. And I think most doctors are not going to go out of their way to recommend it when it's on every street corner in my city. Do you know what I mean? Like they would just be like, you're an idiot not to do this. I mean, but they're not going to be in a position where they're going to be advocating for that for their patient. Especially when their patient is as old as my grandmother and they may be accustomed, and this is what happens to older folks, is they just kind of get stuck on these pills. Like they just get given these pills instead of having vibrant lives till the very end. They're just kind of stuck on these pills. It's heartbreaking for me in that I don't like being a black sheep. Like I feel like my family doesn't respect my input, and that makes me feel like a black sheep, and I get offended and I become very defensive and angry. And then I retreat and am hurt, right? So it's not helpful to me because I don't feel valued, and it's not helpful to my relationship with my family, who I'm sure there are members of my family who feel that they do love me and that they do appreciate me, even if I don't feel appreciated, that they would disagree and say that they do appreciate me. But what upsets me is I thought perhaps enough feedback could go up that chain of command. I have relatives within that same family whose children smoke marijuana, whose children smoke marijuana regularly, whose parents smoked marijuana once upon a time, and whose parents smoked marijuana once upon a time. So it's not like you aren't dealing with people whose grandchildren are currently smoking marijuana, is kind of the ultimate irony here. But if I were to go to like a teenager in this case, who's, let's say, their grandmother is part of that decision making process, for my grandmother to not have marijuana or cannabis, or even visit with the naturopath and see, just to see, have a conversation, just to start a conversation and be open to what is the naturopath prescribe. When I conjure up in my mind, like, well, what if I could talk to this teenager to try to, convince their mom or their relative, that marijuana is not bad because they do it themselves. And the response that I get is pretty much like, no, this teenager is not at a place where they can challenge that system, which really speaks to the hierarchy of the system, which, as I stated before, is a very masculine based system. So it still has those overtones of the hierarchy that we associate with patriarchy, which is that there's like the grandfather and then the father and then the son. There's very much that energy there. So to actually speak out against it has been so difficult. And I've really had to be like the one lone voice. And maybe because of what happened with my mom and how, if she hadn't died from this disease that took her life under the conditions that she did, in terms of how she got so much better and came off hospice after she implemented this supplement that I highly recommended. Like, at what point am I feeling like my grandmother's life matters more to me. My grandmother's comfort matters more to me. Every day that my grandmother's sitting in pain matters to me. And this is like family that's like not even receptive to marijuana cream, like on the body for muscle aches and pains. There's now new like fibromyalgia patches that you can buy that have marijuana in them that you can put on externally on your body. Like if I had my grandmother, I would, and I was in charge, I would take her to the naturopath to look at more natural medicine and then see how maybe we could find a strain that works for her that doesn't make her feel woozy or anything like that, but that helps her with her pain. And we could go to the store and look at all 200 at the medical dispensary, and just really have a more progressive attitude. Because what bothers me is that there's some real racism here. And the racism is that Western medicine is literally like what, 200 years old as far as like doling out the pills. Like let's just say 200 years old in terms of this obsession with getting pills pumped into people and making big pharma rich. But prior to that 200 years, we had plant medicine, right? The oldest shamans in the world are buried with plant medicine. There are temples in Mexico erected to mushrooms. Like research DMT and Moses. I mean, like hallucinogens and marijuana have been part of midwifery and medicinal medicine since the dawn of time. So really these are brown people's medicines, and it's a war on brown people's medicines. And that's what I see happening nowadays. It's like there's this war on brown people's medicines where the white Western establishment wants to be like, no, 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 these medicines aren't legit, they're not real, but they've been around pretty much since the dawn of time. And anything that patriarchy wants to dismiss and reframe as being questionable and not professional enough, you know, but all the big pharma drugs are totally professional enough, and that's adequate healing. I just want to pause and ask for us to have like a collective pause in our consciousness around the racism here. The racism is anything that's a brown people medicine, a plant-based medicine, right? Is considered questionable, is considered suspect. There's nothing fucking suspect about cannabis. Do you know what I mean? It's just as good for pain, especially for cancer survivors. If you look at the research in terms of dementia, if you look at the research, like there's nothing better. And why would you want to be on painkillers that grog you up and hurt your liver and lead to dependence and numb you out? And that's the heartbreaking part, is numbing my grandmother out. And I don't want my grandmother to be numbed out, and I want my grandmother to have the utmost healing that she possibly could have. But I'm treated like horribly in terms of my efforts to try to be heard in this discussion. And that's so painful, and it's been just so hurtful for me in terms of my relationship with my family, because my mother's not here. And so in a lot of ways, my grandmother is like this last mother figure that I love so much. And then I've had frustrations with my cousins or even my siblings, and that they've said to me, you know, you're right. I hear you. This is a totally legitimate argument. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to stand up for this. And then I asked them later, like, well, did you stand up for that? Like, am I still out here fighting alone for this, for an issue that I shouldn't be fighting alone on, for an issue that other people should be fighting with me on? So I'll ask other folks, like, have you decided to do something about this? Have you, you know, risked yourself to put yourself outside of your comfort zone to fight for our grandmother? Is there anything you could possibly do regarding that issue? And I'll bring up the issue of my mother and how she was on the SAMe and how they told me nothing could save her and she was dying. And finally I got to put her on the SAMe. And like, even if I don't have a medical degree, you know, I'm a licensed mental health therapist, like, but I've also worked in health and healing. And also the time I've spent with medicine men and women in the Native community, but also living in Belize with a medicine man, that's not documented in my family's eyes, like, which really speaks to the racism of our culture, which is my time with the medicine men and women in the Native community with shamans and with the medicine man in Belize, the Bushman, are not even documentable to them. Like, I also worked with a Cuban doctor with an El Salvadorian refugee village and was like his assistant for a while in his little clinic that the Cuban government sponsored. But my point is that anything having to do with indigenous medicine is discredited in our culture. So if you come with medical knowledge or shamanic knowledge or knowledge of plant medicines, like I did run the greenhouse at my college, like that's discredited, not just because of this family culture of patriarchy that I'm speaking to, but also it's discredited because there's this war on brown people medicine where anytime you're studying with a healer who's not part of an accredited university, it's just not considered valid learning, which is heartbreaking because, you see all kinds of shamanic or midwifery or things taught from the Amazon or in different indigenous communities that is just as valid. It's historical learning. It's learning that's passed down in a lot of ways. It really deserves that respect. So I've experienced this frustration because I thought that I was going to get all this support with my grandmother and other folks within my family, my siblings or my cousins who literally said to me, "You have such a point here." Maybe they're part of the cannabis movement anyway, and that's the irony is like even when you have folks that are like absolutely part of that movement and absolutely on board with cannabis as medicine, they would rather not stick their necks out. And that's the hard lesson that I've had to learn through this whole thing is that what it speaks to me even more is that family culture of I would rather have an amicable relationship with my family members than rock the boat. So if my mom were dying again, they're the kind of people, and I don't mean to be harsh, who literally wouldn't have pushed the Sammy, wouldn't have asked about the Sammy, and would have let my mom die the first time, basically. Like they wouldn't have been that pain in everyone's ass that's like, hello, I have another answer. I have another medicine. Like, please try this out. Like, trust me, it's not going to hurt anything. Just try it out. You know, being that annoying voice is not a lot of fun. It's kind of like being Cassandra from the Greek myths, who always knows the truth, but no one believes. And then what she says comes to be true, and then everyone hates her. Like, it's really not a lot of fun. So my point is that I'm not saying I'm without fault or that I'm always perfect. I don't even believe in perfection. I think we're all imperfect, and that's the ultimate perfection. My point here is that I've gone through this other kind of psychological defeat, which is that people that I love and respect, who literally told me that they would advocate and fight for my grandmother, have not done so, right? But they're on board, right? They're on board with the medicine, they're on board with cannabis, they're on board with seeing the naturopath, they're on board for all of it. They're totally in agreement with me. I've spent hours on the phone with these people. Literally, they'll look me in the eyes and be like, you are so right, and I'm going to stand up for this, and I'm going to make my voice heard, and maybe if enough of us say something, we'll finally get somewhere, and blah, blah, blah. And then nothing happens. And my response to that is why? And it really comes down to discomfort and comfort, which brings me back to Gabor Mate's speech that he did earlier this year, where he talks about sickness and disease and what makes people sick and be diseased. And it's that they stuff, right? So they avoid conflict because they believe that expressing anger or having an opinion or having a difference of opinion is somehow toxic, is somehow a bad negative. But it's not. It's actually fine. It's neutral, right? You can disagree with people. You can have conflict. You can say, I totally disagree with you, right? You are wrong. I think you're wrong, right? You can have these conversations and you can still work through them, and you get somewhere because you're expressing yourself. You get somewhere because you're letting stuff out of you, right? So what happens for people when they're in dysfunctional families, and so many families are dysfunctional, but like when you're in a dysfunctional family and you're trying to bring truth and light to that family and you're fighting your hardest, you're going to come up against the resistance of the family, which is if a family is a broken system. And right now I'm really upset because I have a cousin who's basically homeless, and my family doesn't see their role in my cousin's trials and tribulations. They dismiss his trials and tribulations. They compartmentalize their own lives. They think it's not their problem, or they don't speak up about it, and they don't challenge the family system. And what I keep coming back to is still the same bullshit. It's the not rocking the boat. It's I'm not going to risk my relationship with, this uncle or this cousin. I want everything to be pleasant and pleasurable. And in my family, you really get you get perks, like you get support for buying a house, or you get things within the family as long as you tout that family line, as long as you don't rock the boat, as long as you don't challenge those elders, especially the patriarchal kind of rigid, whatever, leaders hierarchically in terms of who is allotted to have decision-making power. So it's not a collective, it's not organic in that it's like, here's everyone that loves and cares about this beautiful elder who has been like a second mom to me, you know. And so what happens is you're asking people to shift their comfort zone and advocate, and in doing so, that would alter their relationships, and they wouldn't benefit in the same way that they're accustomed to benefiting. They wouldn't benefit in that placid, like, we get along, but we never talk about anything very deep. We get along, but everything's good and we help each other out, but we never talk about times that I've hurt you and times that you've hurt me. Like, we never go deep in our relationship, and we never like question or have conflict, so we keep things on a superficial level. That's not growth. That's not really growing. So that's not a family that's really growing. That's a family that, you know, has these like self identified little like danger zones where everyone has roped off areas where they're like, don't go there. That's my, you know, danger zone. That's where I have some buried, you know, bombs that, you know, never were detonated. Like, everyone has their little area, and so everyone agrees not to step on anyone else's toes. So basically, you don't step on my toes, I won't step on your toes. We'll have a superficial relationship, we'll call it good, we'll call it a family. So when I come into that dynamic, and I say, well, I want to talk as a therapist about the family as a unit, as a structure. I want to talk about the fact that my grandmother deserves this medicine and deserves to see a naturopath, and she's going to be led there or not led there, is my argument, by those around her, right? So if she had people that were guiding her who literally were like, we're going to open your mind up to some different kinds of healing. We're going to go look at some different kinds of healing. Just gather some information, whether it's acupuncture, massage, or plant medicine, or cannabis, or what have you. So that requires a shift in thinking to get to that point where attitudes would change, right? Opinions would change. In order for our opinion to change, in order for us to see our own role and see how we are impacting things. So I have family members that may not see how they're impacting these decisions because they don't have awareness themselves of their own hurt child, right? They don't see ways they're responding out of defensiveness. They're not seeing ways that they're responding out of a need for control or a need of being valued. Sometimes when you're within a family, and let's say you've been treated like shit your whole life, you've always been the fuck up child, then maybe at the end of your life, you get to play a pivotal role. It kind of redeems your self-esteem. You know, you kind of feel finally validated, and that means something to you, right? So you're not quick to relinquish that. You don't want that thunder stolen from you. You want to play that key role. So that would speak to ego, right? Ego and defensiveness and all this other stuff. So I could be a passive participant like so many of my siblings and cousins and say, oh, this bothers me. Obviously, I see this medicine over here that would help my grandmother. This all bothers me, but I'm not going to do anything about that because I don't want to rock the boat, and she's close to death anyway. I'll just let her ride this out, and she can be on Oxycontin. It's all good. And really, for me, that speaks to weakness, right? That we aren't willing to challenge the status quo because we're fearful of how it impacts us. So we're also selfish, right? We're selfish and we're weak. And it bothers me, not because I don't love my family. I don't think I would be so hurt by my family if I didn't love my family. Like, these are the people that helped raise me, you know, for good or for worse, for, you know, for good or for bad. These are the people that raised me. Like, now, did they do a very good job? Did they really give me the love that I needed or I deserved? Like, that's still kind of up for, you know, questioning. But my point is that if I'm a valued member of the family, if what happened with my mom's health matters to these people, then they should listen to me. They should not discredit my words or my opinions or my feelings. But they do. And oftentimes that speaks to other people's level of self actualization. If you're someone who's been rejected your whole life, then how you will deal with others is when you are made uncomfortable by where others are pushing you or where others are asking questions that trigger you, you will use rejection as a tool. You may not use it consciously, but you will use rejection as a tool. And so oftentimes in my own family, I experience like that people do a lot of abandonment. There was a lot of emotional neglect that went on in the family. And so what you do when you emotionally abandon somebody is if you make your love somewhat conditional. You say, even if subconsciously the message to the child or to the adult is, I will love you as long as you stay in this box. I will take care of you as long as you stay in this box. I will give you affection and be a secure support to you as long as you stay in this box. If you can't stay in this box, then I will withdraw my affection. If you challenge me, I will withdraw my affection. If you push me and really question me or contradict me, I won't allow that, and you will be dismissed and I will ignore you. And so a lot of times what it happens is people will be ignored, and really what it is it's emotional abandonment. So when people choose to ignore you, it's basically like cutting that tie of, I'm no longer going to support you emotionally because I'm made uncomfortable by what you're asking me, or I'm made uncomfortable by having conflict with you. So I'm going to abandon you emotionally, which is a very cold action. For anyone who's ever been adopted or anything like that, it can be very much like very similar to like a severing of a tie, a severing of a relationship. So somebody who's been basically trained to be responsive to abandonment, sometimes children who've had, like I mentioned that in my family, there's been this history of women not getting everything they needed from their mothers emotionally. So then the child is trained from a very young age to be triggered by abandonment, by rejection. Rejection literally will get that child to behave because the child is so mind programmed to be responsive to rejection. And that's really unfortunate because it's really an act of cruelty when you think about it. So when your family basically emotionally removes themselves or cuts ties emotionally or severs ties or emotionally abandons you, it actually is a kind of a re-triggering of that early mind programming, which is if you don't do what I say, I'm going to withdraw affection. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to reject you. And so it really taps into that child's fear, even that adult child, which says, I better behave or I will be abandoned. I better stuff my emotions or I will be rejected by those who love me. So it's really an act of cruelty. And I would even argue that it's an act of war, that it's an act of warfare. When I comment on these issues, I don't say these from a place of anger or a place of hate. I love my grandmother with all my heart. I think about her daily. So these are feelings of emotion, but they're feelings of love. They're feelings of kindness, of care. I'm very much wanting my grandmother's time as she departs this earth to be valuable and special time, right? And I also want to remove the shame in families from talking about these critical issues. So when I talk about the hierarchy of the family or how we sometimes redeem ourselves as adults, if we were not the favored child, if we were the fuck up, but we finally get to redeem ourselves on some level, there's an intricate web of complexity in terms of the psychological implications of family roles and emotions and history and what was allowed and what isn't or what wasn't, that's contributing to these experiences. So these are very complex family experiences that we're having, and sometimes people aren't willing to go there. It's too deep for them. But if you read any good literature, I mean, it really speaks to the intensity of those relationships and how profound they are, right? They're so profound and they can really shape our future, and they also can shape what we think of ourselves. So sometimes we won't realize that we are misusing power in our family because we're not conscious of ourselves. We're not conscious of the power we have, and we're also not conscious of why we have that power, and we're not conscious of maybe why the other person has given us that power, because these are deep, complex questions. And sometimes we do not live in a society that cultivates introspection. We don't live in a society that cultivates the deeper questioning of the self. But by talking about these things, I'm not saying that my family is any different than any other family. I'm speaking to the pain and suffering that I'm experiencing, or that I see in my family, and the dysfunction in my family, and how it contributes to my grandmother, and my desires for her health, and for her to have the best health possible, the best options for her health possible. But it's also speaking to the blockheadedness of my family and where that originates, which is sometimes we are opposed to an idea because it contradicts our idea. And if we were to incorporate this new idea into our schema, we would have to re-alter our sense of who are we, what is our role, have we misused power, or is there something we could have done better? And that brings in issues of shame and caretaking and value and roles, and what my role has been in the family, and whether that's now questioned. Am I really doing my role in the family? Do others not see me doing my role in the family? And it can cause a flurry of anxiety for that individual. So it's really critical that the message be sent that these complexities are ongoing. They're not unique to one family. And we can reduce the shame related to asking questions. We can reduce the shame in talking about emotions and expressing emotions, and we can disagree, and we can do so in ways that aren't about rejecting the other person or abandoning them emotionally, or showing them that we will emotionally abandon them as a form of war. Thank you.